I would say number one, unhealthy mindset when it comes to growth would be feeling as if you always have to be on.
Let's start by talking about at first, like, why do you think growth is even important to humans to begin with?
I think for most people, growth is important because a lot of people want to see that there's some progression in what they're doing. A lot of humans have issues feeling stuck.
Mm-hmm.
Even if you think of, not in a psychological way, just being okay with the land that you have and the space that you occupy, there can be a very innate want for more.
Okay, and where do you think that, like, is that just something that we're born with? I mean, you did say innate, so I guess that does mean that we just have it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so what do you think is something that, like, what are some unhealthy mindsets that people can have around growth before we get into the healthy part?
Mm-hmm. I think some unhealthy mindsets can be having the hustler mentality all the time. Like, if you're not resting, or if you are resting and you're not filling that space with productive time to say, I was working on this and I was grinding, that can be very unhealthy because you're not giving yourself, space and time to actually process growth and what that means.
Okay. And then even within that, I can see, like, even having the need to even just show it, right? Because there are people who maybe not aren't grinding all the time, but they want to perpetuate that, like, stereotype of the hustler, that I'm always doing this, I'm always having I'm always working, I'm always going for the next thing. And I mean, in your field, like, understanding that time off is as beneficial to your mental health as, like, going after the thing that you want to do, that you would say that's accurate, or what would you say about that?
Yeah, definitely. I have been actually working with some clients recently in terms of being very involved in like a on the go, constantly having to be on work culture. And for a lot of people, I've been inviting them to consider when you say no to something or when you set a boundary, what is that saying yes to? So even in saying, I have a boundary that I'm going to end work at this time, someone may not feel productive because they're going to think, I have all this other work, it's going to pile up. But in reality, the work is going to be there. Are you going to be working with the same quality if you keep working nonstop? Or is it best to kind of pause, take some time to reset so that the work you do is more efficient and productive?
So where do you think that even comes from, that idea that you have to constantly be working?
It can come from a lot of places. I think culturally, in Western society, American society, that's a huge thing. Your worth can be equated to how much money you have and how much work you do, because a lot of the times people get money from the work that they did. For some people, it can be a function of anxiety in trying to fill space and time. Even with someone who may experience depression, or even if you're just going through a rough moment, it can be very appealing to fill free time and silence with distractions.
So what do you think social media, let me ask that again, um, what impact do you think social media has on that same, like, drive to either continually be doing things or appearing to be doing things at all time?
I would say social media definitely reinforces that cycle. So when reinforcing something, it's like increasing the probability of that behavior. So if people get praise, attention, validation for those kind of behaviors that they put out there, or the perspective perception that they might be doing those things, it kind of reaffirms to them like, okay, in order to get this attention, praise, validation, this is what garners that.
Mm-hmm. So what do you think then are like healthy or positive mindsets to have when looking at growth or seeking growth or analyzing if you are growing?
I think one of the main things to do with most things I can think about in life is to really keep in mind moderation.
Mm-hmm.
So are you being a little too focused on constantly having to be on the go? Another thing that can help is pausing to really check in with what your intentions are. So are you doing things like posting, hey, sent an email, are you doing things like that for attention? Because that is a need that you have. That doesn't mean that that's wrong. Clearly you have a need for attention. But are you really focused on growth in an internal way? Or even just acknowledging, like maybe part of your growth can involve both internal and external factors. So really checking in to see, do you genuinely feel like you're growing? Or do you feel like there's a pressure to show that you're growing, even though you feel like you're not?
Mm-hmm. When I thought of this, doing this topic, it made me think of those, memes that you see all over the internet, like expectation versus reality.
Mm-hmm.
And like the expectation that people have when they're growing is that there's like this like surge in like attention that they get, or like there's a surge in validation, or like that the growth is going to be something that's so obvious to you that you miss it. Mm-hmm. Where in reality, a lot of times you're growing and you just don't feel like it because you're measuring yourself up to someone who might be farther along than you are. Mm-hmm. So like, how do you think that applies to growth mindset?
I think checking into more frequently to say, is there something that I'm doing now that is different or an improvement from before, even if it was 2 weeks ago? For me, I'm sure most people know by now, like I really love to journal. So sometimes I'll go back in time and I look at my thoughts and certain things that seem so big, or a situation that I was like, oh my God, I don't know what to do and I feel stuck. It gives me a lot of perspective to see like, okay, I did change and I did grow. It's also reminding yourself that growth is a very, very slow process. Mm-hmm. And a lot of people will not recognize it until they reach a point that there is something that seems drastic. Mm-hmm. But the in-between is what most people are uncomfortable with. So we have our plant here, right? And I feel like sometimes we look at it and 2 days later it's like, oh my God, where'd that leaf come from? It didn't just pop up overnight. It's been growing, and we haven't looked. When we're not looking at it, it is constantly in a state of growth. So I kind of think of, humans being in that way, and it doesn't always feel comfortable or fulfilling. It can be frustrating because you want to skip to the part where you know everything already.
Mm-hmm. So then how do you tell someone to measure their growth? Because that really is something that people, I think, are looking for. They need a way to measure their growth other than like the social media way of like, okay, I had 100 likes on this post. Now I have 200 likes. That's growth. But there are other ways of measuring growth. What do you think those are?
So before you go into measuring growth, first you want to identify what that means to you. Do you have specific goals? And then that can kind of help you narrow down like, okay, if I wanted to communicate with other people more, then you can start tracking like, okay, how many times did I actually initiate communication? If I'm someone who's shy and I say hi to people, but like in a way that I know they probably don't hear me, mm-hmm. a challenge can be, okay, once a week, I'm going to like speak in a louder tone of voice and say good morning to this person. And then that can be a more measurable thing to say like, okay, I did do that.
Cool. So what do you think are things that then block us from obtaining the growth that we're seeking?
I think for most people, and again, like in so many other parts of our life, there can be conflicting or opposing parts. So even with growth comes questioning, what are you leaving behind, or what is going to change? And that might not be something that is on the surface that people can identify, but I think sometimes there can be a fear of, what does this really mean? Actually, recently, it's interesting that you asked me to talk about growth, because I think randomly in the shower, of course, everything.
Where all best ideas come from.
Yeah, in the shower. I kind of thought of growth sometimes feeling like you're abandoning other people, at least for me personally. Focusing on my growth can feel like I'm abandoning other people. And then I kind of reframed it to think, well, but I have a limited amount of time and space and energy and resources. So I'm trying to divide something into more parts. And it makes sense that I would then have less available for other people.
It's like a pizza pie that instead of you're trying to divide it 8 times, you're trying to divide it 32 times.
Mm-hmm.
That's a great analogy.
Or it may not be equal pieces. It might be like, maybe because you eat more than me, I gave you 2/3. But maybe I'm like, actually, I need to start. I'm malnourished.
Right.
And you could, go without some slices. So I'm going to take 2/3 of this pie, and you get the other, the lesser side.
Right. That wasn't even something that I had initially thought of bringing up, was how do you deal with those competing forces for your own time and attention when you are focusing on growing in any particular thing? Like, I know, to use myself as example, when you are trying to get better at any skill, you have to put time into it. Like, there's always repetitions, and there are going to be things that you now don't do anymore. There are things that you're going to turn down. There are going to be, events that you can't go to because, you really want to do this thing. Mm-hmm. Like, so how do you deal with that?
I think a lot of what you said is definitely part of it. So realizing there is going to be some sacrifice and checking in consistently with what your intention is, especially when it gets hard. It's not easy, especially when it comes to relationships and other people. So if someone is kind of telling you something and you feel like guilt is being activated, it can be hard to fight the urge to fall back into overcompensating or giving someone more time. Mm-hmm. So really checking in with yourself, also giving yourself some grace, because you're human, and there are going to be times where it's easier to say like, okay, I'm going to go back to this thing. So it really is finding ways that are manageable and realistic for you to take those steps. So even if you say, I want to do self-care, but it's not realistic for you to do an hour every day. It's like, okay, 5 minutes every day. Mm-hmm. Finding ways to make that compromise. And again, like I said, giving yourself a lot of grace and saying, okay, I didn't do it today, but today my priority was to give time to this person, and that's fine. That was a need that they had, and that was a need that I had. What can I do tomorrow? What can I do to focus on tomorrow or even later? So that, you kind of hold space for being a person and anticipating change. When it comes to growth, especially like mental health growth, it's very interesting to see the individual and the ripples in the entire system within your life. It's bound to change. So really realizing that things can be disrupted in ways you didn't anticipate, and giving yourself a lot of time and patience and compromise.
Awesome. So to wrap it up, would you summarize like a couple of things that you think are unhealthy mindsets to have around growth? Mm-hmm. And then we'll list a couple of things that are healthy.
Okay. So I would say number one, unhealthy mindset when it comes to growth would be feeling as if you always have to be on. I think that's number one. Another unhealthy mindset around growth is feeling that you can take these steps to grow, without there being any other sacrifice. You have to be realistic. There is going to be somewhere that you're compromising. So just being okay with that. The third thing I would say is focusing on growth and not knowing what your true, authentic intentions are. You know, are you doing this for someone else? Are you doing that for yourself?
And now the positive ones.
So the positive ones I would say is, you know, really checking in with yourself. Why do you want to grow? Is it because it's trendy, or do you really feel like you want to grow? Sitting down with yourself and having a conversation with yourself, being curious with yourself. Another thing when it comes to growth is giving yourself patience and grace and trying to withhold judgment. You know, remembering that you're a human and you're not going to be perfect and growth is messy. Another positive thing when it comes to growth is, I think, really just being open and remembering, you know, it's a really hard process.
That's awesome. All right, that's it.